This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Hello everyone, I'm very excited to welcome you to a new tutorial because one, we recently hit 50,000 subscribers. And two, today marks the start of a new series called Weekend Visual Effects. With this series, we plan on creating tutorials that cover different kinds of effects that you might have either seen on films or commercials. We're gonna be utilizing After Effects as always, since that is the main software that we use. And today, we're gonna be playing around with holograms. Lots of cool stuff to cover, as you saw from the breakdown video, so I don't want to drag on for too long, but I do want to mention that apart from After Effects, we'll also be using Buju, which is a 3D tracking software. And this is mainly due to the fact that it is a lot better compared to the built-in After Effects tracker. But no need to worry if you don't have access to Buju, since you're probably going to be able to get away with using the built-in tracker in After Effects or any other 3D tracking software out there, like Synthesize or even PFTrack. By the way, let me know if you guys would be interested in an in-depth tutorial about Buju. Apart from that, everything else that we're going to be covering today is native to After Effects. The footage that we're going to use is going to be included in the project files, and you can download that by going over to the description down below, and that way you can practice and also follow along. If you have any suggestions for visual effects tutorials in the future, then make sure to leave them down below. With all that said, let's jump right in and get started. Alright, so here we are now in After Effects, and as you can see I have the original main comp open with all these layers. And we're going to come back to this towards the end just to take a look at the other hologram versions that we have designed, because mainly we're going to be focusing on the hologram watch design. And then for the other ones, we're going to go through all the techniques and effects that we use to achieve those UI elements, but not in so much detail, since that would take way too long to recreate each one of these from scratch and then animate them. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go over to the materials folder, and this is our hologram footage. We're going to click and drag into the new comp icon, and what this does is basically is going to create a new comp for us based on our clip's settings. So you can see down here it says 25 frames per second and 7 seconds long. You can also control click on the numbers here to alternate between the two different display styles. And up here you can also see the resolution, which is indeed Ultra HD 3840 by 2160. If you want for some reason to change these or modify the settings, you can right click on it, go over to composition settings, or go over to composition settings, or even use the Control K shortcut. And we're going to be using a bunch of shortcuts along the way just because they do speed up the workflow, and it's always good to know as many shortcuts as possible. The next step is to track our footage. And as I said in the beginning, we will be using Buju, which is a different software, so it's not native to After Effects. But feel free to use any software that you might be familiar with. Maybe even try using the built-in After Effects tracker, but I personally don't really find it that good when it comes to object tracking. But it is very good when it comes to environment tracking, for example. And to be honest with you, I did play around with the built-in tracker for this specific footage, and I didn't really manage to get any good results. Now, before we go ahead and export our footage, say this was log, so it's like a flat picture profile. Well, you want to make sure you color correct it first before sending it over, just because if you don't have a contrasting image, it's going to be very hard for the tracking software to differentiate between different areas. So therefore, you're not going to be able to get a really good track out of it. Again, the resolution is also a good help. So the more resolution you have, the better. And in our case, it is 4K. So if we zoom in here, you can see that these details are actually quite sharp. And then one last thing I like to do is to add the unsharp effect. To do that, we can either right click, go over to effect, or even use the effect menu up here, or even use the effects and presets bar over here on the right. But what I like to do instead is use the FX console plugin, which is from videocopilot.net. And it is free, so I would definitely recommend that you check it out. So we can access it by clicking Control Space, and that brings up this menu, which we can then type in the effect. So we'll say unsharp mask and just hit return. Now, if we zoom in here and just toggle the effect on and off, just focus on the numbers for a second. So if you toggle off and then toggle on, you can see it's very similar to the sharpen effect, but much better since it only adds contrast to the edges of your details here on the footage. You can even play around with the values here. So say we set it to 100 amount. Well, that just makes it pop even more, but just be careful with this. We don't want to overdo it. So we'll set it back to 50. And next up, we can just start exporting this. Now, when it comes to Buju, it tends to prefer JPEG sequences or PNG sequences. So let's go ahead and select this, go over to composition, add to render queue. And then on the output module, we can click on that, go over to the format, and we'll select JPEG sequence, leave the other settings as they are, and then hit OK. We can also set our destination and then hit render. Alright, so here we are now in Buju. And before we get started with the tracking process, I again want to mention that if you guys would be interested in an in-depth tutorial about Buju, then just let me know in the comment section down below. Alright, so let's get started by first importing our sequence. So let's click import sequence and then select the first one and then click open, and that will import the entire sequence. Now let's take a look at the settings here. And first off, we have the move type. And we have two options here. So we have free move or nodal pan. Nodal pan means that you have a static camera that's just panning and tilting. Whereas a free move camera means that you have a camera that's not only panning and tilting, but is also moving around in 3D space. So let's click free move. Then we have the frame rate, which remember, it was 25 frames per second. But before we set it to that, let's just say for a moment that we have a clip that is 24 frames per second. And we'll hit apply. And you can see what happened. The frame rate jumped from 24 to 25. And I wanted to mention this because I believe it is a bug within Buju. So in cases where your shot is not 25 frames per second, you would have to set it back to 24, then hit apply one more time, and then it would stay at 24. But let's just switch it back to 25 because that's what we have, and hit apply and hit close. Now, before we do anything else, let's just first set the focal length of our shot. And we can do that by going over to the focal constraint. And this opens up the focal length menu. Now there's two important options here. So we got the range, which right now is set to constant, but if we double click, this brings up a menu. In cases where you have a shot that doesn't have any zoom in it, you would leave it at constant. But if you have a shot that does zoom in and out, then you would set it to varying. So in our case, we'll leave it at constant. And then there's the type, which right now is set to unknown. And this controls the focal length. And by leaving it at unknown, Buju is basically going to guess what kind of focal length we have once we click track features. And we don't really want that because once we export our track and bring it back in After Effects, once we start putting in any elements or any layers in 3D space, we might see that we have a, say for example, 20mm camera, and that would look very weird because it would have a very wide perspective. So always be wary of that and always take notes about your shots whenever you know that you're going to track them later on. So we'll double click on it and then switch over to a fixed value. You can't really read it well, so we'll just expand this. And then the value is basically how many millimeters your focal length is. So we'll double click on it. And in our case, it was shot at 50 millimeters. So we'll type in 50 and we'll close it. Now, if we click track features right away, Buju would basically look at the entire scene and just track everything. But what we want to do is just to isolate the watch. We're going to use a poly mask. So we'll click on that and then make some points around here. So we'll click and drag and point and point and point and point. If you go down here into the layers section, you can see that the mask has been created and there's a keyframe that has been set at that same frame. Now let's go over back to where we actually see our character clicking on the watch. So we know that we're gonna actually see the hologram from this point on. So let's go over to frame 60 and we'll click and drag our mask. By the way, you can click the middle point here to move the mask around. Then you can click the left point here to scale it up and down. And then also the right point to rotate it around. You can see if we rotate from very close up, it tends to spin very fast. But if we go over here, you can spin it a bit slower so you can have better control over it. Scale it down just a bit, modify the edges. You can see down here in the mask or like the layers section, whenever you adjust your mask, it will create a keyframe automatically for you. So we can scrub through time here and then just move this over. You can see another keyframe has been created and keep tracking this. All right, so once we have our mask tracked, there's one more thing we have to do. Right now, the mask is actually being subtracted from our scene. So if we click track features, everything would be tracked apart from the watch. What we want to do is just right click, go over to invert mask, and that just isolates only the watch. And now we can click track features. And right away you can select if you want to track all frames or just a selected range. So we'll click on the selected range and set the start value to 60. Next up, you have the advanced menu, which brings up a few more options. The first options here are the minimum and maximum search distance. These are very similar to the tracking points in After Effects, where you would make a point and then adjust the bounding box around it so that the search area would be a bit larger. And this would be useful, for example, if you have very fast moving objects in your scene, where they would jump from one area of your shot all the way to the other area, for example. So in that case, it would move in very large amount of pixels. So increasing this would increase the search distance around the last known location of your object. But in our case, we don't really have a fast moving object, so we'll leave it at default. Next up, we have sensitivity. And if you increase this, normally you would have more points popping up. And what's gonna happen is it's gonna look at very small details, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the higher the sensitivity, the better your track is gonna be. Instead, it could actually be bad for your track, just because if you increase this all the way to 100%, and say you have a very grainy footage, well, it could actually look at the noise patterns and just mess up your track completely. So we'll leave it at default. Next up, we have the feature scale. And say you had a slightly out of focus shot, well, in that case, you would choose large just because it would look at larger contrasting points. But seeing as we have everything in focus, we're just gonna leave it at normal. Then you have the channel select, so you can only track by using the blue and green channel or the red and green or whatever. And then finally, you have the fast tracking option, which I never use. With all that covered, we can click start. And as you can see, it did start tracking from frame 60, since that's what we set for the selected range. Now, once we have a feature track, what we have to do is camera solve this. So we'll go over to camera solve and we'll leave it at all frames, since it's gonna ignore any frames that don't have any tracking features on them. And then next up, we have the advanced solve refinement. So there's a couple more options here. There's the optimize radial distortion parameters, which takes into account any distortion that you might have in your footage. So say you shot with a wide angle lens. And then next up, we have optimize camera path smoothness. And usually you would turn this on if you have a very smooth camera movement. So if you shot with a gimbal or a steady cam. And so that would give you a very smooth tracking result. But in our case, we're trying to track an object which potentially has very small micro movements. So let's not turn that on and let's hit start. And there you go, we finally have a camera solve. So if we zoom in here by using the scroll wheel, you can focus on some of these points and you can see that they do indeed track very well. You can also switch to the 3D view and hold down shift and left click to orbit around, or hold down shift and right click to dolly in and out. And if we orbit around here, we can also see our camera right there in the background. And since we did not check the optimized camera path smoothness, you can see that there are very sharp turns in some areas here, so that's pretty good. It looks pretty cool. You can see how our watch has actually been recreated in a point cloud. Anyway, we can go back to the 2D view and we can finally export this. Now, if we were to export this into a 3D software, so for example 3ds Max, Maya, Blender, well then we would export all of these points because they can handle them quite well. Now in our case, we will be exporting to After Effects, which will then be imported as null layers, and that can slow things down quite a bit. So what we're gonna do is just zoom in here and just pick a few points which we know we can use as reference. So we'll select this one here, we'll hold down Control to add to this selection, we'll select that one, maybe a few more of these. And then this one here and this one here is good. We'll right click on the points and we'll click flag for export. Now, once we go over to the export camera, we can set the export type. So this is the format and we can choose After Effects and Maya. And basically they use the same format. So we'll click on that. Then the move type, we have moving camera static scene, which in our case is correct. And then we have the export flag tracks only option. So let's click on that. And this will make sure we export only those points that we flagged. And then finally, we have the scale scene by value. And usually when I'm exporting for After Effects, I like to set it to 1000 just to make sure things are nice and large and not so small. Because then if you have very small objects, things can get a bit tedious. With all that set up, let's hit save. Alright, so now we're back in After Effects and I went ahead and imported the track data. And as you can see, we have it right here. So we can double click on it. And you can see we have a bunch of null layers and a single camera. And we can go ahead and select the camera, go over to Layer, Camera Settings. And we can see that it is indeed a 50mm camera just because we did set it up in the beginning before we did any tracking. Now let's hit OK. Let's just select all of them, edit, copy, and then go over to the main comp, edit, paste, or just use the shortcuts. And right now we can't really see them just because I have hidden the UI elements. And you can use the Ctrl-Shift-H shortcut for that. And this will make them appear and disappear. Now if we hold down Ctrl and deselect the camera, then hit S for scale, you can see that these are all set at 5%, so we can set them back to 100% so we can see them a bit better, so they're nice and large. And right now you can see that there's a slight issue. They're not really lining up. Now if you go back to the camera, select it and hit U to bring up the keyframes, you can see they actually start from frame 0. So what we have to do is go over to frame 60, since that's where we tracked from, and then go over one more frame, so he'll hit page down to go over to frame 61. And we'll click and drag those. And we're doing that because Buju actually starts on frame 1. So frame 1 for Buju is frame 0 for After Effects. You can see if we slowly scrub through here, everything is actually lining up. So there you go, we have a very good looking track. We can select all of these, Control A, drop them down, and then we can select just the nulls, and we'll turn on the shy button here. And then turn it on for the entire comp. And this will basically hide any shy layers, just so we have a very clean looking composition. Now we can finally get to the fun part, which is designing the hologram. Now, before we start messing around with the hologram designs, just make sure you're set at 32 bits per channel because we will be using a bunch of color effects and a bunch of glow effects. And so we're gonna need maximum color accuracy. And you can toggle that by holding down Alt and left clicking. So you got 8, 16 and 32. Let's start by going over to Layer, New Solid, or you can use Control Y. We'll rename this to Watch Base and we'll set the width and height to 1000. Leave the color at white and hit OK. Then we'll select the rectangle tool here. We'll click and hold on it and this will reveal all these other shapes. Or you can click Q to toggle between the different shapes. And we want to be on the ellipse tool. And then just double click. And this will give us a perfect circle since we have a perfect square. Then we'll pre-compose this, so we can go over to Layer, Pre-compose, or Ctrl-Shift-C. We'll move all attributes and we'll call this Hologram Base Pre-comp and we'll hit OK. Then we'll go inside of that comp. Let's just close the track comp here so it's not confusing. Then we'll turn this into a 3D layer, select it, we'll hit down W to bring up the rotation tool, click on the X and hold down Shift to snap it to 45 degrees and we'll just make it lay down flat on the ground. Also make sure it's right there at the center of the comp so that it makes things a lot easier to position them back in the main comp. So back in the main comp, you can see we can't see anything and that's because we did lay it flat. The next step is to continuously rasterize this layer. And what that does is it allows all of these layers to be treated as if they are inside of this main comp layer instead. Now we need to also turn this into a 3D layer and you can see everything is working properly. What we have to do is position this to be in the same spot as the watch. So what we're going to do is select one of these null objects. We'll have to uncheck the shy button here so we can see these layers and we'll select that null. We'll hit P to bring up the position, copy the position, so Control C, and then select the hologram base here and Control V to paste it. Now what we're going to do is just rotate it. So we'll click W to bring up the rotation tool and we'll rotate it and and we'll scale it up and down just to like try to match it perfectly to the watch. So we'll bring it over in Z space a bit. We'll orient it that way, maybe orient the Y, something like that. We can even hit T to bring up the opacity and bring the opacity down. And we're just gonna try to match the angle to be right there at the center. So we'll hit S to bring up the scale and scale it down. Now what happens is once we have that set up in there, we can bring the opacity back to 100%, hit B to bring up the work area here, and we'll just hit 0 to RAM preview. And you can see that it is indeed following along pretty well. Now let's click on the shy button to hide those layers once again, and let's go back to the hologram base pre-comp. And seeing as now this is a pre-comp, what we can do is just start creating a bunch of elements inside of this comp, and they will show up right here. Now, of course, we do need to make sure we leave the base of all of our layers to be at the center, since the anchor point of this comp is at the center as well. And so that'll make things pretty easy to set up. You know, you don't have to hassle around. We'll know that the ground level point is right here at the center. So let's quickly just duplicate this, make a few copies, push them up, bring this one more time. By the way, I'm duplicating these by clicking Control D, or you can select it and go over to Edit, Duplicate. Then we'll select this one, hit S, maybe bring up the scale. And if we go back here, you can see that automatically updates. And you can see there's this bounding box that's gonna show up, and that just lets you know how big this actually is within the comp itself. Now if we make some more drastic changes here, so you can see what's going on, maybe even select all of them, hit T, bring the opacity down. Oops, let's just set this to third so we can preview a bit better or faster. And now once we have all that set up, we can start designing our hologram. So let's delete the other two layers, set this to 100%, and let's start playing around with a few things. First of all, we can switch to the top view, and this way we can see our layer from top down. Now for the original design, what I did was to have the base of the watch be a bit more intense around the edges. So as if there's some light coming in from these edges here. And then there's also a more intense core, but then around the core, it's a bit more faded. So what we're gonna do to achieve that is to go back here, and we'll go over to the watch base that we have here, and we'll double click M. So MM. This will bring up the mask properties. We'll select it and then click Control D to duplicate, and we'll set this bottom one to subtract, and then we'll play around with the mask expansion just to like bring it in a bit, something like that. And then we'll increase the feather, and then we'll duplicate this, hit MM once again, and we'll delete the second one that we created. Then we'll double click on the mask, scale it down, and we'll hold down Control and Shift to scale it down proportionally. So we'll bring it right there at the center. And we'll feather this one as well. And then maybe we can rename this to say core, this one outer edge. We can also duplicate the core one more time, and we'll rename this to core big. Hit F to bring up the feather and feather it out even more, just to give it a very smooth fall off. And then we'll duplicate the outer edge one more time. We'll bring it at the top and then just decrease the feather, so it's a very tight around the edges there. And we'll hit MM to bring up the mask expansion, and we'll decrease the expansion. And we'll also decrease the opacity a little bit of this outer edge. So you can see it's a lot more intense around the edges and a lot more intense around the core here. It's worth noting that from this point on, everything that we do is very subjective. So whatever it is that I'm designing doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you should be doing as well. So it's just a matter of taste and also making sure that all of these elements make sense in one way or another. Now, one last detail we're going to add is to duplicate the outer edge one more time, and we'll hit F to bring up the feather. And this time we're also going to be feathering the first mask here. And when we increase this, you can see that we're actually clipping on the edges, since the bounding box of our solid is only 1000 by 1000. Now we can easily fix this by selecting both of these masks and double clicking on them, and we can scale those down until we no longer see any clipping. And then we'll select the layer itself, hit S, and we'll increase the scale back up. And now we have just a little bit of glow around the edges here. Finally, let's select all of them and just set them back to screen so they blend with each other. And we could also play around with the opacity values, but I think it looks good for now. And finally, we'll give it some animation. So let's select one of these cores, duplicate it, Control D, bring it at the top, and we'll call this Reveal Animation. And we'll double click on the mask so we can scale it up, something like that. And we'll hit F and we'll bring it down all the way at 0. maybe just slightly push it a bit, something like that. Maybe scale it down so we make sure it's not clipping. So what we'll do is set it to silhouette alpha. And what this does is basically alpha mats everything underneath it. And what we're gonna do is just scale it up until we can't see anything else. We'll go over here at frame 0, hit the scale stopwatch, and now we'll go over to say frame 15, and we'll put it down to 0%, therefore just revealing the entire base. We can also select this and hit F9 to smooth it out, and even right click, keyframe velocity, and maybe set this to 100% so that it very quickly reveals itself. One more thing we can do is to actually animate the opacity of these so they look as if they're flickering. So let's select one of them, solo it out. We'll hit T to bring up the opacity, and we'll set a keyframe there at the beginning, and we'll set it to 0%. Now we can move forward or backwards by one frame by either hitting page up or page down. So we'll go over to frame 5, we'll bring this up to 100%, then we'll go back, bring it down, go back again. Actually, we'll just bring this over and leave it at 100%. Select all of them and hit F9, and that just smooths things out. So if we preview it, it looks as if it's just kind of flickering and then finally coming to a stop. And I'm thinking we could maybe even just make these a little bit faster, so we can select them all, push them over, maybe 100% on that. And we can just copy all of these, but then that would mess up with the opacity values that we have here. So we'll set these up. We can set a keyframe for all of those, and we'll copy all of these keyframes apart from the last one, so we'll know what they end up with. So we'll paste them on all of these, and we'll just select all of these, hit F9, right click, keyframe velocity, and set it to 100%. And we can unsolo that. We can even click on these and just drag them over a bit. Now we can go back to the main comp just to see how everything is looking. And at the start here, you will notice that there's a black hole. And that's because, as we said, every layer inside of this comp is going to be treated as if it is inside of this comp if you have the collapse transformations option open, until you add an effect to it. So let's just add a tint effect real quick. So we'll control space, tint, and that now enables us to set these to whatever we want. So if we go back to normal, we can set it to add, we can set it to screen, whatever we want to do. There's also the motion blur option here. Oh, that reminds me, we'll select all of these, turn the motion blur on for all of them, and now that black hole has disappeared. Now we're going to worry about beautifying this and colorizing it later on, so we'll just shut off the tint effect, and then we'll right click on this one, we'll go over to reveal layer source in project, and what we'll do is just Control D to duplicate that, and we'll rename this to hologram watch tutorial. And then we'll double click to open that, and now we'll start working on the other UI elements. First of all, let's just select all of these and delete them. And we'll start using some shape layers now. So let's go over to the rectangle tool. We'll select the ellipse tool and double click once again. And what we want to do is have a perfect circle one more time. So we'll go down to the ellipse contents and we'll delete the fill. And then under the ellipse path, let's unlink the size values, and we'll set this to 1000 by 1000 just for consistency. And then under the stroke, we can play around with the stroke. And now let's start creating a few different elements here. First of all, we're gonna have to turn this into a 3D layer. If we go back to the front view, you can still see it, but we're gonna have to orient it upwards. So we'll select it, click W to bring up the rotation tool, hold down Shift and just flatten it out. Then we can go back to the top view so we can see it properly. And if we go back to the main comp here, we'll switch this to full view. And we'll turn that off, and we'll also shy all of those nulls. You can see the metal of the watch has this sort of zigzag pattern around the edges. So let's try and create that. We'll go back to the hologram comp here, and we'll rename this to zigzag. And there's a very cool effect inside of shape layers. We'll just go over to add and zigzag, and you can see that already gives it some zigzag edges. And we can control the size, so how much that just extrudes outwards, and then the ridges per segment, so we'll increase that quite a bit, so something like that, but maybe we'll decrease the size. There's also the option for the points, so either corner points or smooth points, so you have these sort of waves. And I'm thinking the stroke width is a bit too large, so we'll bring that down to maybe 20. We can come back to these and adjust them later on. We'll duplicate this one more time. Now we'll rename this to normal circle. We'll go down to the contents, and for this one we'll delete the zigzag, and we'll go over to the front view, and we'll just bring this up a bit so it just sits right on top there. By the way, we can switch to two views, and we'll leave this one on the left to front view and this one on the right to top view. And then we can use both of these views to position them properly. Now let's duplicate this one more time and push it up. And we could manually just match the amount of distance here, or we could use math. So we'll select the zigzag and the normal circle. We'll hit P to bring up the position, and you can see the position of the zigzag is right there at the center, which is 1080. And then we push the normal circle up 800, and we just minus those, and that's 280. So what we'll do is hit P on the normal circle too. We'll do 800 minus 280, and that should give us the same amount of distance for both of those. Now for this one, let's just shut off these so we can see them a bit better, and we'll go down here into the contents. And under the stroke width, we're gonna increase that quite a lot. And we're gonna go over to the dashes. We'll just hit plus and we'll increase that. And you can hold down Control until you have this sort of perfect space between all of these dashes. And we'll do big dotted lines. Then we'll duplicate this one more time. We're not gonna change the position this time around. We'll do small dotted lines. We'll go down to the contents one more time, and under the stroke we'll just decrease this. Of course, we're not going to be able to see it too well, but if we select this one, hit T to bring up the opacity and bring it down, we'll decrease the stroke width till it's a bit thinner. And then under the dashes, we can even make some adjustments. So we have a few more lines, or rather something like that. So the other way around. And we'll decrease the stroke width. And I'm thinking we'll go here, go over to dash. By the way, you can search whatever properties you want so you can easily and quickly find them instead of having to drop down all of these contents. And we can increase or decrease this. So again, hold down Control to really dial it in, because as you can see up here, you know, there's these duplicates and you want to set it just right. That's pretty much just a single layer, I guess. And then we can duplicate the normal circle one more time and bring it at the top. Sorry for all the autosaves. You know, I've had projects where I didn't save for a long time, and the autosave function was every 20 or 30 minutes. And basically, I had to go jump off a building and then come back and then jump off again. So what I did was just have it autosave every 3 to 5 minutes, I think. So there's that. And then finally, we'll rename this to thin circle, bring up the position, and we'll do minus 560, right? And now we'll turn these back on, and we'll go over to one view, and we'll switch to custom view, and this will allow us to orbit around in a non-destructive way. So it's as if we have a camera on our scene when in reality we don't. So we'll switch to the camera tool and we'll click and drag to orbit around, and that's pretty much our hologram design. I'm thinking the zigzag is a bit too thick, so we'll go down to the stroke width, maybe set this to 10. Again, we're gonna be playing around with these. This one, the thin circle, maybe set that to 10 as well. Sorry if I'm going a bit too quick here, but you get the idea. Once we talk about a certain feature that After Effects has, then from that point on, I'm just gonna assume that you know what I'm doing. Hopefully it won't be confusing for you guys. I'm also noticing that these layers don't have motion blur enabled, so we'll turn that on. And now finally, we'll go ahead and create the watch numbers and dots and all those extra details. First of all, let's go back to the active camera view, and we'll click on the text tool here, and we'll click and drag and type in 1. And we'll hit Control-Alt-Home to center the anchor point to the layer, and then Control-Home to center it to the composition itself. Then we can hit S for scale and bring it up so we can see it a bit better. And for the numbers, I think I used a font called Roman font. So let's see, yep, that one. So you got these Roman numbers. Now we're gonna have to center the anchor point one more time and center it to the composition just because of the difference of the font. And now we're gonna make 12 duplicates. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And we're gonna go ahead and just adjust these so that they match their corresponding numbers. Now for 10, for some reason, it registers as 1 and 0 as opposed to 10. So we can just type in X, because that's 10 in Roman. And then for 11, we'll do the same thing, X and then 1, and then 12, X and 2 ones. Now let's shut these off for a moment. And we'll go ahead and create a new solid. So layer new solid, make sure it's 1000 by 1000. And we'll do the good old double click on the circle. And we'll go under the mask and we'll select the mask path and hit Control-C to copy. And let's just bring it at the top. And we'll select all the number layers, hit P to bring up the position. And then we'll select the position for each of these. So we'll do that. And then just hit Control-V to paste. And this way, what'll happen is if we turn them on and maybe just solo this 11 number, it's gonna be animated around the circle. Now, how can this be useful for what we're trying to do? Well, let's just make some room here. select all of these and bring them over to frame 0. And seeing as we have 12 numbers, we're gonna go over to frame 12. And with all of the frames selected, we're gonna hold down Alt and click on the last keyframe and make sure the last keyframe falls on the 12th frame. Trust me, this will all make sense in a second here. Pun intended. Now let's go over to frame 0. We'll solo all the other layers and we'll actually select them all. Maybe hit S for scale and we'll just scale them down a bit, maybe to 100, 150. Bring the position back and we'll move one frame at a time and just uncheck the position keyframe so that they all land within their respective positions. So in this case, up here we need to have 12. Well, we're gonna uncheck the position value and it's gonna be stuck right there. Now, if we move forward, this here is gonna be 11. So we're gonna uncheck the 11 position keyframe or stopwatch, then keep going and keep going. And there you go, a perfect circle watch with numbers. Now, in order to scale them up all at the same time without actually scaling them up from their own anchor point, so maybe we'll leave them at 135. What we'll do is first off, let's turn them all into 3D layers and also turn the motion blur on. Then we'll create a new null object, turn this into a 3D layer, and we'll parent all of those to our null. And then what we'll do is just hit W, bring up the rotation tool, and then hold down Shift and just orient it that way. We'll unsolo all of these so we can see all the other elements. Maybe go back to 2 views. This is the front view. This should be the top view. And we'll select the null and just make sure we bring this all the way at the top. And again, we can use math to just position it properly. So that's 240 minus 280, if I remember correctly. I think that's right. Looking at the top view here, I'm thinking maybe we scale those down so that they fit within this inner circle here. And maybe we can even select all of those, just scale them down a bit. We don't really want to make them too small because then you won't be able to notice. But again, it's all up to you. Next up, we can even just duplicate this one more time and we'll copy the position of the null and paste it to that. And we'll call this clock middle point or circle. And we'll just hit S, bring up the scale and just scale it down. We can zoom in here, you see things are starting to slow down a bit. Hit Control Shift H to hide all the UI elements and we can slightly scale it down like that. And maybe hit stroke width and just put it to 20, maybe even 60. And then finally, we can even have some lines for the hour indicator and the minutes indicator. And we can do that by maybe going over to the rectangle tool. Make sure you don't have anything selected and then double click. And this will create a rectangle based on your composition settings. And then we'll go over to rectangle. Under rectangle path, right click and convert to Bezier path. And then we'll hit G to bring up the pen tool and we'll select both of these points. So we'll hold down Shift to add to the selection and then hit delete. And now we have a single line here. Now we'll delete the fill because we don't need that. And then for the stroke, we can increase it a little bit. Maybe turn it into a 3D layer. And maybe hit Control Alt Home to center it to itself. And just copy the position from this null and paste it to that. And we'll call this hours. And of course, we can't really see it yet on the top view. And that's because its orientation is set to frontal. So we'll have to click W, hold down Shift and rotate it upwards. Okay, that's good. And we'll make adjustments accordingly. Now we'll scale it down. We'll use the scale. You can see how easy it is to make adjustments by using multiple views. And since we set it up properly in the beginning, now we can work in a very easy and efficient way. And then all the way back here at the main comp, we can automatically see the update. Except we can't because we haven't imported it yet. So we'll duplicate this. Then we'll grab the hologram watch tutorial here and we'll hold down Alt and then click and drag and drop to replace it. And this basically just puts it in the same spot. And seeing as we kept the base of all of our layers at the center of our composition, then we won't have to do any extra work. Maybe we'll just have to scale it up a bit. So we'll see maybe 100% scale. Just try to match it to the contours of the watch here. So something like that. We'll switch back to quarter view and we'll turn the motion blur off and maybe even push it up a bit more. We're definitely not going to be able to get the same result as in the original example, but we'll do our best. Now, if we go back here, we'll continue working on these hours and minutes lines. So we'll select it here on the top view and we'll hit Y to bring up the anchor point and we'll click and hold down Control to snap it to one of these sides here. And we can hit P to bring up the position and we can set the X value to 1920, and that should put it right there at the middle. And then we can hit S to bring up the scale again and just play around with the scale till we have something that we're happy with. And from what I know, hours are a bit shorter compared to minute lines. Hit R to bring up the rotation. We're gonna have to rotate the Z. So we'll do that. We'll duplicate it. We'll rename this to minutes, and we'll hit S to bring up the scale and just scale it up a bit, and hit R, and we'll just adjust the rotation. We'll do, I don't know. So it's 145, so something like that, I guess. And then we'll select both of those one more time. We'll type in stroke width, and we'll set it to 15, because I don't want it to be so thick. And we'll also turn on the motion blur for these two layers. Another detail I added in the original design was to have some points along each of the numbers here. And to do that, we're going to use the same method as before with all the numbers and the mask path trick. So we can orbit around. That looks pretty cool. One thing that does bother me quite a lot, and I think I actually fixed this in the original design, is that the circle here is not the same thickness as the lines. So let's go ahead and make the clock middle circle a bit thicker. So we'll search for stroke, and we'll do double the size, so 120. And another thing is, I don't really want to see these lines inside of the circle, so we'll duplicate that, go under the contents, and we'll add a fill effect, and we'll rename this to clock middle circle matte. Hit the tilde key, by the way, to maximize any view your mouse cursor is hovering over. And we'll just bring this on top of the minutes, Control D to duplicate, and bring it on top of the hours. We'll select hours and minutes, and we'll set it to alpha inverted. And so now they'll be masked off and you won't be able to see them at the center there. There's this sort of aliasing and edge going on here that's visible. So let's maybe select those mattes and we'll scale them down just a bit, and that'll make them disappear. And there you go. That looks a lot cleaner now. Now let's go back to the custom view one and finally start animating this thing. Now we need to also parent everything to each other so that we don't have to animate all these things. So we'll delete this. We'll select all of these points. We'll also parent that to the numbers controller and turn the motion blur on for all of those. And we'll also bring this one over, which is the clock middle circle. And we'll parent that to the numbers control as well. Now by adjusting the null, you can see that everything follows along. So let's Control Z to put that back in its place. And we'll select the null. Then we'll select all these other circles. We'll hit P to bring up the position, set a keyframe, and then we'll go back to 0, and then we'll set a keyframe for all of those, and we'll switch back to front view. And what we're gonna do is deselect the bottom one, and then just keep pushing these until all of them are just sitting on top of each other. So we'll zoom in here, make it go very close. Then we'll deselect the last one again. We'll bring them close like so. And we'll deselect that. Actually, these are in the same spot, so we're gonna have to deselect both of those. Bring them down, and then deselect the thin circle, and then one last time, just bring all of the numbers right there on top. I'm not worrying too much about the spacing here. And now what we can do is select the last keyframes, hold down Shift, add to the selection by selecting the numbers control as well, and then right click, keyframe assistant, easy ease, and then right click, keyframe velocity, and we'll do 75% and hit OK. And this way, they sort of all extrude upwards. Now I'm thinking this is a bit too slow, so let's just first bring this all the way down here so it's not too cluttered. And we'll select all these keyframes and bring them back to 1 second. So it's a very fast animation. Okay, so as far as the position goes, it's looking pretty sweet. Now we can also go ahead and mess around with the opacity values and add some trim paths effects to some of these. So for example, with the original zigzag circle, what we'll do is go over here to the contents, and we're gonna add a trim paths effect. And the trim paths effect basically just trims the path. So if we solo this, you can see it's just starting to come in from that side. And I'm thinking that looks pretty good. So we'll set the stopwatch there, bring it at the beginning here, and then go over here and set it to 100%. Maybe ease that, hit F9, keyframe velocity, 75%. Maybe just go over by 10 frames and bring this over. By the way, just so you know, we're probably gonna speed things up from this point on just so we can animate things a bit quicker. Now let's solo the normal circle as well. What we can do with this one is to actually animate the scale and the stroke width. So we'll hold down Shift and press S to bring up the scale while at the same time keeping the position value. We'll hit the stopwatch and then we'll also search for stroke width hit the stopwatch on that, and then clear the search. And then we'll click U to bring up all of the keyframes. And now we can see the stroke width, position, and scale keyframes. And we'll go over to 20, and we'll bring these over like so. We'll go back a few frames, and we'll just increase the stroke width, and then decrease this all the way down to 0%. And we'll just push this over. And we'll match that. By the way, whenever you're adjusting the keyframe velocity of keyframes that are not the same value, so for example, if you want to adjust the keyframe velocity of the stroke width and the scale at the same time, you're going to notice that not both of them are being adjusted. Instead, as you can see here, if you right click on the keyframe velocity of the scale, it's still at 33%. You're only going to be able to adjust the keyframe velocity of the first value that you selected. So keep that in mind. You're going to have to adjust both of those manually. Or if you happen to have this Flow plugin, which again is a third-party plugin, which you definitely don't need in this case, but what it allows you to do is to save presets of velocities. So let's say we control click, bring them back to linear keyframes. I have set up some presets here, and we can set them all to 75% by just double clicking on them. And this way you can set the velocity of multiple keyframes and different values at the same time. It's just a pretty handy tool to have. Again, you don't need it, but I'm going to use it since I do have it, just to save ourselves some time. Now, if we preview that, you can see how that comes in. So it's a pretty cool looking animation. Maybe we can even speed this up. So we'll select both of those without moving the position, because we want to keep the position consistent with all the other layers. So we'll go to frame 15. Next up, let's bring up the dotted lines, and we'll actually add the trim paths effect to both this and the small dotted lines as well. So we'll go over to the zigzag, drop down to the trim paths, hit Ctrl C to copy, and then select both the big dotted lines and the small dotted lines. Go over at the beginning here and hit Ctrl V. I'm just thinking that we're gonna have the dotted lines come in a bit later. Maybe just push those over. And I think I also added a constant rotation to these dotted lines and the zigzag. And the way we can do that is by going over to the zigzag, for example, and hit R to bring up the rotation. And then let's see, which one do we need to rotate? So we need to rotate around the Z. So we'll alt click on the Z rotation, and we'll type in time times 50. So what this means is it's gonna rotate by 50 degrees every second. And I'm thinking that's a bit too much, so we'll tone it down to maybe 20. And then we'll copy this, bring the rotation for the dotted lines as well. We'll alt click on that, and maybe we'll give it some variation. So we'll do 30 on this, and then we'll copy that. And then alt click on this one, we'll do 30 as well, but we'll also add, I don't know, 180 degrees. You're not gonna be able to notice this too much. Maybe if we increase the speed a little bit. Next up, we have the thin circle at the top. We'll hit S, bring up the scale, and we'll animate the scale of this too. Go over to 1 second, bring this down to 0, and we'll do 75%, see how that looks. Moving on, we finally have all the letters and numbers and dots at the top here. And let's go ahead and get started with the hours, minutes, and the circle dot in the middle. And what we'll do is select both of these, and we'll parent them to the clock middle circle. We'll actually bring this one at the top. And we'll start by animating the scale of these. Right about here, maybe we can start animating the clock middle circle. And we'll actually parent these two as well. So we'll animate the scale. We'll go over to 1 second and 5 frames. We'll set a keyframe there, and we'll go back, and we'll set the scale for this to 0. And seeing as those are parented to the middle circle, they actually scale with it. Now, additionally, I want to push these over to 15, and then bring these over here just so I can see the animation. And what I want to do is just decrease the X to be at 0 on both of those, so they also get extended like so. Of course, let's also ease these, so 100%. And then finally, we can just do a simple fade in for all of the numbers. Let's hit the tilde key, we'll unsolo all of these, and we'll solo the numbers and the dots as well. And what we'll do is figure out the ordering of these. So we want to have number 1 come in at the start. So we'll go over to top view, and we're also going to shift the timing by, say, for example, 4 frames maybe. And to do that, what we're going to do is select all of these, hit T to bring up the opacity, set a keyframe, and we'll set the opacity down to 0%. Then we'll hold down shift and hit page down to go forward by 10 frames. And we'll bring these back to 100%. and then we'll hit F9 to easy ease those. Then we'll go over to frame 0 one more time. We'll select number 1, hold down shift, we'll select number 12. I guess I should point this out that depending on how you select these, so if you select them from the bottom up, it's gonna shift them from bottom up. So number 1 is gonna be the first, and then you got number 2 and number 3 and number 4. Whereas if you select them from the top to bottom, the first layer is gonna be number 12, and then after that is gonna come number 11, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So just make sure you select number 1 first, and then select number 12. We'll move forward by how many frames we want to shift them from each other. 1, 2. We'll hold down Alt and close square bracket to trim them at the playhead. Then we'll right click, keyframe assistant, sequence layers, and hit OK. Then we'll just click and drag and extend them. And we'll do the same thing for these ones. Just make sure you select the bottom one first. We'll go 1, 2, 3, Alt, close square bracket, right click, keyframe assistant, sequence layers, hit OK, and then just click and drag. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the animation so far. So let's go back to the main comp and let's just give it a quick preview here. And it just looks so much better when you actually see it together with the footage. And one last thing we can do is to actually animate the pre-comp itself. So we'll hit S to bring up the scale, and we'll go over to 4 seconds, set a keyframe there, and we'll bring it back. I'll do, I don't know, maybe 30. And over on 4 seconds, we'll even scale it up a bit more just because I think it's a bit small. So, and we'll select this one, hit F9, and we'll do 100%. Maybe even push it to 5 seconds. So it's a very smoothly comes to a stop. All right, so it's looking pretty cool. Now we're gonna go ahead and start beautifying this. Let's start by colorizing our hologram. And to do that, we're gonna use an effect called Color Vibrance. So Color Vibrance. And this too is from Video Copilot. It has a bunch of options here and it is totally free. So let's delete the tint effect and let's start playing around with the colors. So we'll switch this back to half resolution so we can see things a bit better. There's the color. So we'll set that to maybe a blue. Next up, you got the vibrance, which sort of acts like the saturation. And we'll leave that at 0.5 just because I don't really want it to be as saturated. Then we'll leave the preserve luminance to 1, and we'll also play around with the brightness. There's also this cool option which says fill empty background, and if I turn this back to normal blend mode and turn the fill empty background on, you can see it basically gives it a black background, and this acts the same way as a solid composite effect, for example. So if we control space, add a solid composite effect and turn this to black, you can see what that does. Except if we just take a snapshot real quick, uncheck that and fill empty background, if you see the difference, it's not really doing the same thing. So it's a pretty cool effect. It allows you to just fill that in, and then finally you can set this back to screen and you can see those elements a lot clearer. So without the fill empty background, with the fill empty background. And then next up we have the invert, which just inverts the fill. And then finally we have matte alpha, which we can set to on. And that allows us to boost the alpha. So we'll do like 0.5. We could even animate these values. So say at the beginning here, before it actually pops up, we could animate the brightness, hit U to bring up the keyframe, and then move forward in time here to about 315, set a keyframe. And then for the first keyframe, we can set it back to 0% so that it actually fades up. So the brightness, becomes more intense. Next up, let's just control space, add a glow effect. We'll increase the glow here, and what we're gonna do is just decrease the intensity quite a bit. We'll just solo this out with the footage so that the hologram base isn't so distracting. I wanna have a very tight glow, so we'll do glow intensity 1 and the radius not so wide. Then we'll duplicate the glow one more time. We'll bring this down a bit, do the same thing here actually. You see it's a bit too slow to work with, so bear with me. Then we'll increase the intensity. We'll decrease the threshold just a little bit, and we'll also increase the radius, maybe not so much, maybe around there. We bring the threshold back, and we'll set this back to 0.1, and then we'll duplicate it one last time, and this time just increase the radius like crazy, so like 300, and we could maybe even just slightly reduce the threshold. So we got a very smooth looking glow, and of course you can always go back on these and just adjust them. Maybe decrease the threshold on the first one. The first glow is very tight, so it's probably going to be the brightest there. And there's definitely some opacity values that I need to tweak. So we'll go back to the hologram watch here and we'll select the dotted lines, like the big ones. And we'll do T for opacity and we'll bring them back to 5%. And we'll do small dotted lines to 40%. We'll do the thin circle at the top, maybe 50%. And we'll see how that looks because everything is a bit too intense right now. So we'll do alpha boost 1. And we'll go back to the hologram and we'll actually do the big dotted lines to 2%. Just because even though it's 1% here and you can barely see it, because of all the glow effects and the alpha boost and all these things, you can still see it quite a bit here in the main comp. So we'll even do 1% actually. There you go. It's not so distracting right now. And maybe even the small dotted lines, we'll do that 10%. So the focus is mainly on the numbers here. Now let's quickly copy all of these effects, Control C, and we'll unsolo these and paste it to the hologram base as well. You know, it's just disappeared, and that's because the brightness is set to 0. And wherever your playhead is when you paste things, that's where the keyframes are going to start. So let's select the base, hit U to bring up the keyframes, and we'll just bring these over right at the beginning. And we'll actually just delete these altogether. I think it is a bit too intense. So first off, let's just delete glow number 1. Increase the threshold on both of these so we don't have as much glow, and then also increase the radius. So it's a very wide glow. And we'll see before and after. We'll copy the color code, go over here, paste it. By the way, later on, we're going to look at how we can actually set up a global null controller that controls all colors in your scene. That way, you don't have to hassle around each layer and just manually adjust these colors. You have everything in one place. Now, we're already at a point where we could say we've got a decent looking hologram, but it is a bit too perfect, and in real life, nothing is perfect. So it's always good to try and implement that into our visual effects work. And what I mean by that is to always try and match our visual effects elements to the look of our footage. So for example, in our case, even though we have 4K footage, if we zoom in here, let me just solo that and put that to full. You can see that the numbers are still not so sharp. Now, let me just turn that off, the unsharp effect. By the way, I forgot to turn that off. And the unsharp effect is actually very slow. Up until this point, we've been working with that on, and that could have been the reason for all the slow speed here. Oh my God. Anyway, as I was saying, even though we shot this at 4K, the numbers here, they're still not 100% sharp. And then secondly, we have to try and think about how these elements would look like if they were there physically in real life. So would there be any glow coming in, which we already have? Would there also be some light being cast onto the arm here? Or rays being shot up from the watch maybe? Since light is bursting from the watch. And when you think about all those details, then it becomes a lot easier to create stuff that matches your shots. And hopefully in the end, the effect also looks cool. Because when it comes to visual effects, as much as it is about realism, we also have to consider the stylizing factor. So let's go ahead and try to replicate the things that we mentioned so far. Starting with the base ray. So let's select the hologram base. We'll Control D to duplicate that, and we'll solo it out for a moment. So let's Control Space, and we're gonna add an effect called CC Light Burst. And we're gonna bring this right on top of the glow effect. So just before the glow number 2. And if we go back to quarter, because this is also a very slow effect, if we hit Control-Shift-H to bring back the UI elements, you can see that there's the center control, and we can bring this at the bottom. And then you have a few controls here, so you got intensity, ray length, and burst. Now, the burst is either straight, you have fade, and then center. And personally, I just like to set it to fade since it just keeps going in the direction that it's supposed to be going and it just fades off. And then you also have the ray length. We can increase that to, I don't know, maybe 400. So we have a very long array. I'm thinking that's a bit too much, so we'll set it back to 100. And maybe we'll bring it closer here. Now, the closer it is to the base, the wider it is gonna be. So keep that in mind. Now, what we can do is also animate these. So we'll unsolo these and go back to the first keyframe here. And we'll hit U to bring up the keyframes, bring them over. And we'll go over by maybe 20 frames. Set the keyframes there as well. And then go back and just set these both to 0%. And then we'll select the layer itself, hit T. We'll bring this opacity down a bit just so it's not so intense. If we just set it to maybe 30% and just see the difference between it being off and then on, that just adds so much, man. That just looks so much better. Now there's one issue, and we can see that better if we solo it back on. And if we move in time here, seeing as the camera is moving, well, this is not a 3D effect, so the center is gonna stay in the same spot. And as I showed you before, depending on where the center is, opposite of that is the direction in which the ray is gonna go. So that means we're gonna have to animate this to keep it in the middle at all times. Well, that's a bit too much work. So what we're gonna do is use our tracking data from before to parent this to one of our nulls. Therefore, it's gonna stay in line with the camera movement. So let's unshy the layers and we'll select them all, solo them as well so we can see them. And we'll try to pick one of these nulls that are roughly in the center here. So we'll do this one. And now what we have to do is extract a 2D point from a 3D null. Normally you can't really do that. You can't really say, for example, alt click on the center and maybe parent that to the position of that specific null, because then you would get an error, because this is a 2D value, you got X and Y, whereas this one is a 3D null, so you got an extra Z value. So what we have to do is actually extract a 2D null from this 3D null. So to do that, we're gonna go ahead and create a new null object. So go over to layer, new null object. Then we'll select the null that we want to parent this to. Let's bring it at the top here. We'll hit P on the 2D null, alt click on the position. We're gonna pick whip it to this null. And now before you let go, just type in dot to comp, open parentheses, open square bracket, 0, 0, 0. And now you can see that the 2D null is following the 3D null, but the null itself is 2D. Therefore, we can parent the center value to this position. So let's just quickly rename this to ray so we know which is which. And then alt click on the center and we'll parent that to the position. You can see that the light burst is right there at the null point. Now, of course, say you want to adjust this. Well, you can't really make any adjustments to this because now this has an expression. Well, what we can do is actually add some slider controllers to this. So let's control space, add a slider control, and we'll do X, duplicate that, we'll rename that to Y. And we'll go back to the expression here. And remember, these are X, Y, and Z. We'll leave the Z at 0. We'll select the X value, parent that to the X slider, and we'll select the Y value and parent that to the Y slider. And now what happens is it's gonna follow that point and we're gonna be able to make adjustments to it. So this way we can actually push it a bit to the right so it's sitting, roughly in the center of the watch there. So that's the solution to that. Now let's go ahead and unsolo these and try to do the same thing with the hologram watch elements. So let's select the hologram watch, duplicate that, and we'll rename that to ray as well. Bring it at the bottom there. And we'll add an effect called CC Vector Blur. So we'll control space, CC Vector Blur. And we'll also bring this one right before the glow effect. We can actually control A to select all of them and just drop them down and then just bring the vector blur back up. Now let's also solo this out so we can see what's going on. And the way the vector blur effect works is it uses a vector map to determine the way the blur is going to happen. So if we increase it right now, things get a bit too crazy because it's using itself as the map. But what we're going to do is actually create a gradient map to use with this effect. So let's go over to layer, new solid, and we'll type in gradient vector blur map. We'll make it comp size and hit OK. We'll control space, add a gradient ramp effect. I'm sure you've seen this effect being used before, so we'll switch the ramp shape to radial ramp. Then we'll swap the sides here, so we'll set this roughly in the middle. And we'll also swap the colors. And you'll see why I'm doing this in a second. So let's just unsolo this and we'll turn it off because we don't need to see it. And back in the ray layer, we'll set the vector map to the gradient vector blur map. Right now, nothing is happening because it is using the source, but we have to switch to the effects and masks, so it uses the effects. And now right away, if we hit Ctrl-Shift-H to hide those, you can see what's going on. So if we increase the amount, everything is being pushed towards the center here because that's the way the gradient ramp effect is set up. Now, if we adjust this, you can see what is going on and we got a very cool effect. So the amount is how intense the stretch is. So I don't know, maybe we'll set it to 400 or something like that. Then there's the ridge smoothness, and just play around with it until you get something that you're happy with. But we'll leave it at default. Then you got the property, and basically right now we're using the lightness since we want to take a look at the black and white values. And if you set it to luminance, it's basically the same thing. But then there's the red, there's the green channel, there's also hue, and there's saturation, and these don't really do anything unless there's color applied to the gradient map. So let's just bring it back to lightness. And then maybe we can increase the map softness. And what happens is, if you see here at the bottom, it just smooths out the corner there. So we'll set it to 100%, we'll leave it there. So it's not so sharp at the bottom there. And now if we move in time here, you can see that we're gonna have the same issue as before with the light burst center value, because the gradient map here, the gradient ramp, is not sitting in the same spot. So what we have to do is actually parent the start of ramp position to our null here. And we'll rename this to ray track, just so we know where everything is standing. And let's turn on the shy layers just so everything is a bit clearer. Hit P to bring up the position. Then we'll go back to the gradient map, alt click on start of ramp, and then we'll parent that to the position. And now that point should also follow along with the null. Now if we go back and turn everything back on, let's just make sure these rays are just set to, I don't know, maybe 25%. And you can see that does so much, man. Oh my god, that just looks so good. Oops, let's bring it back. Oops. I'm getting a bit too excited here. Just try not to make things too obvious, because then it can look as if you're just, you're in love with a certain effect. But if you tone it down to say 15%, that looks a lot better. If we go back to full resolution, hopefully our computer doesn't explode. Now let's start adding some effects that will make this look not so perfect. And first of all, we'll start with the hologram watch, and let's just collapse all of these, and we'll add a fast box blur effect. We'll just add like 0.1 and maybe 2 iterations, and we'll bring this all the way at the top here. It just blurs things out, and then all of these effects render afterwards. And this is just to take off the edge a little bit. Then we'll add another effect which is called Venetian blinds, and we'll also bring this up after the box blur. Let's just solo this out for a moment, and we'll increase the transition completion just so you can see what happens. Go over to quarter, and basically these stripes get created. So what we're trying to replicate is these old scanline effects that you see in most movies. Let's just try to set the angle to match with our object in our hand. Then maybe we can decrease the width so they're not so thick, and just slightly add some feathers. So I don't know, maybe 0.5 or so. Next up, we'll add another effect which is called scatter. And what this does is basically just scatters the pixels of our layer here. So we'll do, I don't know, maybe 3%. And if we zoom in here, you see how that affects the entire layer. Of course, we want to try not to overdo this too much. And then there's another option here called randomize every frame. So you get this noise pattern going on. And then you have grain horizontal or vertical. We'll leave it at both. This is similar to the blur dimensions in the fast box blur. So if we set it to horizontal and increase the value quite a bit, you can see that it spreads out the pixels only horizontally. But we want to set it to both, and then let's set the scatter amount to 3. Now let's quickly copy all of these effects, and we'll paste them only on the base itself, so not the ray. We don't want to affect the rays. So we'll paste them there, and just make sure these are all after those effects. Let's select the ray comps, set them to cyan, and then these ones to orange. I just like to keep things organized by labeling them with colors and also renaming them properly. And I say that, but I have here hologram. For the hologram base, I'm thinking the Venetian blinds aren't looking too good for me, so I'm just gonna shut that off. We'll leave the scatter effect because that just adds a bit of scatter here, so you got these pixels, just to add some extra detail. And we'll go over to the ray, and we'll add a fast box blur effect, because these rays are a bit too sharp for my liking, so we'll do like 2, something like that, because they're a bit too sharp. And maybe even just tone it down a bit, so we'll do like 10%. Another thing we could do is maybe add a lens flare to the watch here. And we could do that by creating a new solid, so right click new solid, we'll set it to black, we'll rename it to flare. We'll control space, type in lens flare, and we'll switch the lens type to 105. Okay, that looks a bit better. And I mainly want to have the colors of the lens flare to be a blue, so it matches with the hologram. So we're going to add a tint effect. So we'll do control space tint. And in this case, we're going to map white to blue. Then we'll set this to screen so we can see it. And we can even go over to the hologram here under the color vibrance. We'll copy the color code and we'll paste it back here to the flare so it matches. Then let's go back to the lens flare and we can set the center there. We're gonna have to animate this so it follows along. And to skip that, what we're gonna do is actually duplicate the ray track here. And we're gonna rename this to lens track. And we'll bring back the position, go back to the flare. We'll alt click on that and then we'll pick this to the lens track. And so this way we can actually modify the lens track to be in a different spot since we need it to be in the center of the watch. So let's also adjust the Y value here. So we'll bring it roughly right there in the middle. And if you take a look at the lens flare here, it's a bit too sharp. So what we'll do is add a CC radial fast blur. And we'll do the same thing with the center for this one. We'll alt click and parent it to the lens track position so it stays in the center. And if we increase the intensity, you can see it just kind of like blurs it out from the center there. You don't want to go crazy with it. So if you set it to 100, it just blows it up, but maybe something around 70 works fine. So you can see without and then with, without, with. And obviously at the beginning here, you don't want to see it. So we'll animate the flare brightness. Go here at the beginning, hit the stopwatch for that, bring it down to 0%, and then move forward a bit, and then bring it back up to 100%. Oops. Now at this point, I'm guessing it's already a very long tutorial, so let's go ahead and make it even longer. Another detail I remember adding is a sort of glitch effect right at the start where the hologram comes in. And the way I did that was to use the turbulent displace effect. So let's solo out the layer here at the top and we'll add the turbulent displace effect. You got a bunch of controls here. You got the displacement method. So you got bulge, twist, and all these things. First of all, what we're gonna do is select the horizontal displacement mode and we'll actually bring it right on top here so that the glow effects happen all the way at the end. Then we'll do an amount of 20 and we'll go at the start here and we'll set a keyframe there. Hit U to bring up the keyframes and we'll move over like so and maybe go over at this point where we can actually see the entire thing and we'll set it back to 0 and we'll F9 that and 75% it. Now we're gonna duplicate this and what we're gonna do is decrease the size all the way down to, I believe it goes down to 2, and we'll double click on the amount so that shows it up in the timeline here, and we'll increase the amount for this one up to like extra crazy. Maybe just bring this over so it happens a bit sooner. And I'm thinking the one at the top here is a bit too intense, so we'll double click on that. And we'll maybe push this over at the start so it happens a bit sooner. It actually fades out a bit sooner. And we'll even set the displacement amount to 15. So you see we have this sort of glitch at the start and then the glitch fades out and we're back to having a clean looking hologram. Finally, we can go ahead and add some environmental lighting. And we can do that one of two ways. So either manually mask the arm here so we can add some light to it, or maybe even use the roto brush effect, which I did in the original version just to save me some time because I didn't want to go through it, rotoscope the entire arm. What is this, like 6,700 frames? And so I'll quickly show you how you can do it manually. I'll show you how you can use the roto brush as well. And in the end, we'll just scratch all that because I'm just going to cheat and go ahead and copy the roto brushed layer from the original comp. Anyway, let's create a new solid. We'll call this arm matte. We'll shut it off for a second. We'll solo the hologram footage here and we'll bring this at the bottom. Now let's just set this to full so we can see everything a bit better. And we'll just mask a single frame. So we'll do something like that. By the way, when you click on these handles, they get controlled at the same time. But to separately control them, you can hold down Alt and you can see the icon switches. And then you can click on it and now you can separately control it. So we'll do it like that and then make a curve like so. And there you go. Now we have our matte. And now let's go over to layer new solid one more time and we'll do lighting. Hit OK. Bring this at the bottom. Click on the track matte here and set it to alpha matte. Now of course you can see here that it's not a perfect mask by any means, but we'll run with it. Next up, let's add a fill effect. And we'll go over to the flare. We'll copy the color code and paste it here, mask this lighting layer around, and we can feather that out like crazy and also set it to, I don't know, maybe add, and maybe we can tone down the opacity. And then we could maybe select both of those, Control D to duplicate, and then we can hit MM to bring up the mask properties. and then increase the expansion. You can see how the edges here get seen just because the matte is not big enough. And so let's also switch this to screen so it's not as intense, and also decrease the opacity as well. It's a bit more intense towards the middle here, and then as it goes along, it sort of fades out. So you can even increase the mask for this one towards this edge. And when we turn them back on and see the difference with and without the lighting, and then normally you would go ahead and animate the matte here. So you would set a keyframe for the mask path and then move forward by, I don't know, maybe 3-4 frames each. And then you would make adjustments here. Now that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to use the built-in roto brush effect that comes with After Effects. So we can select the footage, then select the roto brush tool, and then we can double click on the footage here, zoom out here, and just start painting this in. So the way it works is you just start clicking and painting in. And if you happen to have these contrasting points, like you have the bright arm here, and then there's the black shirt, it's gonna be very easy for After Effects to figure things out. So add to the selection like so. And then once you move forward and backwards by 1 or 2 frames, you can see it actually follows along pretty well. You can see at this point we also have the background covered. So we can hold down Alt and you can see the icon turns to red. And that basically turns on subtract mode. So hold down Alt and just click on that, and that just should remove things. Now, of course, it can mess things up, so you can add them back in, maybe subtract that part, and you get the idea. Now, once we go back here, since we have the effect applied, we can solo that and see what's going on. Then there's a bunch of other options like feathering, you have contrast, then you can shift the edge so you can choke the edge a little bit if you want. If we zoom in here, you can see what's going on. All right, so let's just delete this and let's go over to the main comp here. And we're gonna go down here and we'll just select this matte arm and we're gonna copy the entire layer and then go back to the main comp of our tutorial and then Control V to paste. And you can see it's trimmed there because that's where the effect starts. But we can use this as the matte, and we'll duplicate it, bring it on top here, and we can delete these mattes that we created prior. And now if we solo these ones out, now of course you would also have to animate the path of these lighting layers just to make sure that they follow the watch. And one way you could do that is to actually parent them to lens track. And then we'll select both of them, parent them to the lens track, and now they'll move with it, so you don't have to actually animate that even. This way we're actually making maximum use of the tracking data that we got from Buju. All right, now finally, let's take a look at how we can actually modify the colors of our elements without having to manually go in one by one into each of our elements and just take so much time and hassle around and copy color codes and all that. Well, what we can do is go over to Layer, New, Null Object, and we'll call this Global Colors Controller. And we'll control space, add a color control, and we'll name this to Watch Base. Then let's double click on the color to reveal it in the timeline. You can also do the same thing by right-clicking on it and reveal in timeline. And then we'll go over to the hologram base, double-click on the vibrance, and we'll do the same thing on the ray version as well. So double-click on the color. We can hit the tilde key to maximize the view on the composition here. And we'll alt-click on the color for this, and then pick whip it to the watch base. And we'll do the same thing with the ray. And now if we go back to the view, what's going to happen is whatever color we set here, since we link them together, then those are going to be updated as well. So let's set it back to, I don't know, maybe blue. Now, what about the elements of our watch here? Say we want to have the numbers be a different color compared to all of these circles. Well, it's pretty much the same process. So lock the effects controls on our global colors controller. Then we'll duplicate it and we'll say circles color. We'll duplicate it one more time and then we'll say numbers color. Then we'll click and drag the hologram watch comp and bring it underneath all of our other comps. You can actually stack them on top of each other. Then we'll go back to this one. And then down here, you can see even if we select any of these layers, the effects controls are not going to change. And that's what we want because we want to see this so that we can link them to each other. Now, first of all, let's think about how we would do this. So say we add a fill effect to this top circle here and then do the same thing to all of these. Well, it's just 5 layers and then we can link them one by one to these color values here. And that wouldn't take too long, but think about all the other elements that we have here. Well, that would take way too long to link them up one by one. What we can do is actually add an effect to the thin circle here. So let's control space to add the fill effect. We'll leave it at red. By the way, a new tab gets created here since we added to that. But if we go back here, it is still locked. So let's go back to the effects controls. And then instead of just copying it normally, we can go edit, copy with property links, and then select all of these and hit Ctrl V to paste. And this way, all of those layers effects are now linked to this layers effect. And now we can double click on the color there to reveal it in the timeline, and then go back to the effect controls for the global colors controller, alt click on this, pick whip it to the circle's color. See what I mean? So now if we change this, then the circles inside get changed. And we're gonna do the same process for these ones. Let's just add the fill effect to number 1. So we'll do fill, and we'll do edit, copy with property links, and then we'll paste it to all these other layers. And then for number 1, we'll double click on the color to reveal it in the timeline, go back here, alt click on the color, and then bring it back to the numbers control. And that's pretty much it. Now let's just set the numbers to be sort of an orangish, reddish color, and we'll bring this back here, and we'll go back to the main comp. Now you can see it's actually the other way around, so let's pick that from that, and let's pick this from this. But now you may be able to notice that the color is not quite the same as before. It's a bit too blue, it's a bit too muddy, and we can fix that by going over to the hologram watch layer and just making sure that the color is set to white so that the colors here don't get affected at all. But I'm also thinking that the colors themselves need to be adjusted. So let's go over to the circles color and maybe just brighten them up a bit, and then grab that same color from that just to slightly get back to where we were before. And I'm thinking that's a bit too red, so we'll bring it back towards orangish, yellowish. Okay, so there you go. That's pretty much how you would go about setting up a global color controller. Of course, in our case, we have only 3 controllers here, but say you want to have full control over each individual circle. Well, you'd have to make many duplicates and link the fill effect of all of those layers one by one. Obviously, that could take a bit of time in the beginning just to set things up one by one, but trust me, in the long run, it makes total sense and it's totally worth it, because then you would be very efficient. It would be very easy to get different kinds of looks and combos in a very short amount of time by just having everything locked into one controller. Okay, so apart from that, maybe we can go ahead and create a new adjustment layer and add a curves effect. I'm thinking there's just too much gamma right now, so we'll add a bit of contrast. Maybe even just decrease the opacity of these. A bit too intense. Type in CC for color correction. And we'll do hue and saturation, maybe decrease the saturation a little bit. I don't know, we'll add a vignette, CC vignette. And this is actually a pretty cool effect. It's the same as using masks and just setting it up manually, but now you have an effect. And there's also this very cool value here, which you can increase all the way up to 100%. And it says pin highlights. And so it just gets rid of any vignetting in highlights. And what we can do is actually put it right here, decrease the amount a little bit, just tighten it up, just to like put the focus right there in the center. And maybe on top of all that, we can even add some noise, maybe do 4%. Right now we're at quarter, so it's gonna look like there's a bunch of noise, but if we switch to full, it's not gonna be so noticeable. And I'm thinking just a bit more contrast. I think the noise is a bit too much at the moment, so we could really just tone that down a bit, maybe to 2%. And then one last thing is that, remember in the beginning when I said that I shot this at a slightly higher shutter speed for less motion blur? Well, we can add that back by either using the pixel motion blur effect, which is built into After Effects. And if we solo out our footage, find a spot here where we have lots of movement, so maybe at this point, you can see there's still some motion blur, but not too much. Well, what we can do is Control Space, add the pixel motion blur, and you can see what happens. Basically, it adds fake motion blur. It just calculates the movement within the scene. But there's some samples here that can be seen, and that can be easily fixed by increasing the shutter sample. So we'll do like 15. We can maybe even just tone it down a bit to, I don't know, a shutter angle of 100. So before, after. Before, after. Of course, there's also the third-party paid option, which is Real Smart Motion Blur. And compared to this, it is a bit faster and it is a bit more precise. So if you happen to have that, then definitely use that instead of this one. All right, so as far as the entire process goes, I think we've pretty much covered every step. Next up, we're gonna go ahead and take a look at the other hologram designs, except we're not gonna be recreating those from scratch since that would take way too long. Rather, we're gonna go through all of the different types of techniques and effects that were used to create those elements, and also touch upon some animation parts for some specific elements, just to see how the animation was set up. Think of it as sort of a commentary walkthrough. If you followed along until now, you're probably gonna be able to understand everything else from this point on. But if there is something that you don't quite understand, then feel free to ask any questions down below in the comment section, and I'll do my best to help you guys out. Alright, let's now move on. Okay, so now we're back at the original main comp, and as you can see down here, I have all the same compositions as we had before. Now, apart from these, we also have a few other versions. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few of these. So we'll shut off the hologram watch, and we'll select the hologram map and turn them both on. And remember, this is the main layer, and then this is the array layer. And if you take a look up here, we've basically got the same effects applied. Same thing goes here. So let's go ahead and go inside of the hologram map pre-comp. So double click, and now we're right inside. So let's take a look at how we set these elements up. We're on custom view 1. So if we hit C to bring up the camera tool, we can orbit around freely. Hit H to bring up the pan tool, so you can move around and then zoom in and out with the scroll wheel. And now let's start off with these sort of stripes that represent an island. We'll go down here, scroll down, we've got island 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you take a look at the effects, we basically got a stroke, a roughen edges effect, turbulent displace, and then the fill effect, which controls the color. And just as before, I actually linked these fill effects to the global null controller, so I can control the colors back in the main comp. Now, if we just solo this out and then turn on the mask visibility, you can see that I just drew a simple mask that sort of represents an island. And if we hide the mask right now, we can tweak the brush size, for example. And the stroke effect basically just makes it so that you have a stroke going along your masks. And you can choose that up here at the path. Or if you have multiple masks, you can switch between them, or even use all masks. So if we check all masks, go over to the mask properties here. So we click M and say we duplicate this, Control D, and then we can just select one of them and just rotate it like so. And say we didn't have all masks checked, well, we can increase the brush size. And by the way, right now the opacity is very low, so if we hit T, we can bring that up, or we can Control Z and just increase the exposure right here. This is just for the view, by the way. So if you hover over, you can see that it says affects view only. So this won't do anything to your render. But it is quite useful to just crank that up whenever you have elements in your shot that are very low in opacity, but you don't want to go through the hassle of just adjusting the opacity values just so you can see them. There you go. Now we have a stroke going along only our first mask. We can switch to mask number 2, or we could say all masks. Now let's go ahead and go back to where we started. So we'll go Control Z a few times. Now let's look at a few more options here. So we got brush hardness, which is pretty self-explanatory. Same with opacity. Then you got the start and end value. And if we hide the mask visibility one more time, if we increase or decrease these, you can see what happens. It's pretty much the same as the trim paths effect. So you can animate the end value or the start value, depending on which way you want it to come in. Then you have the spacing, and if this goes all the way up to 100%, you can see that there's pretty much a lot of spacing going on, so you get these dots. But we can bring that down to 0% since we don't want any of that spacing. Next up, we have the roughen edges effect, and let's just turn off the turbulent displace and the roughen edges for a second. And you'll see the difference. Basically, the roughen edges just roughens things up a bit. So if we zoom in here and toggle on and off, maybe go to full resolution, just to give it a bit of texture. And then you have the edge type, so depending on what kind of look you're going for, so you can switch to cut and maybe increase the border. This border value is sort of the intensity value. And so if we increase that a lot and then take a look, oops, that's too much. Take a look at the difference between cut, maybe spiky. But then you got a few other options here, but we'll just go back to the defaults. And then moving down, we have the turbulent displace, which I added just to give it a bit more turbulence. And you can see down here, I got some amount and a size. Displacement type is set to default, which is turbulent. And I think I played around with the evolution on each of these copies, so we don't have the same pattern going on. And then also, if we solo out the other island layers and go up to the stroke, You can see the difference here, since not only are they decreasing in opacity, so if we select all of these, hit T. On top of that, I also adjusted the brush size, so you can see the one at the top has a brush size of 20, then it's 15, 13, 10, and 7. But that's all there is to the island layers, so let's just collapse these, unsolo them. Let's go back to the reset exposure, and there's these dots here, which are using the CC starburst effect. We can't really see it here on our pre-comp, but you can use this exposure value one more time to just boost the exposure, and there you go, you can see them now. Now, if we solo this out, we'll take a look at the CC starburst effect. And let me just quickly actually go ahead and create a new solid, just to show you guys how that works. So we'll add the CC starburst. And right away, let's unsolo that. You'll notice that we can't really see anything, and that's because the CC starburst effect takes the color from the solid color. So we can go over to solid settings, switch this over to white. First of all, we have the scatter value, which basically controls how much they are scattered in 3D space. If we set this to 0, we're gonna get this pattern since there's no scattering going on. Next up, we have speed, which is sort of the velocity. And if this is anything over 0, it's gonna have some movement to it. So let's bring it down to 0. And then you have the grid spacing. So if we increase that, we have bigger dots. And then you have the size. So you can scale that down to have more distance between these layers. And then obviously you can scale up the entire comp or the entire layer to make the dots bigger as a whole. So that's the CC starburst effect, and what I basically did was to have a copy of the island and use that as a mat, so you can see the shape goes around here the same as the islands we had before. Then we also had some grids, so if we select the top grid here and solo that out, and I basically use the grid effect. First of all, we have the size from, and if we change to corner point, it's going to use the corner value. But if you want to keep everything symmetrical, you would switch to width slider, so now you have perfect squares. And then you can control that with the width size. You can see that I also animated that, so if we double click, the squares are a bit smaller, and then as they come into place, they get a bit larger. So, you know, we can demonstrate that even more by doing this. You see how those scale down? Then you have the border size or the thickness. Then you have the option to invert the grid. On top of that, you also have an option to feather the lines, so either horizontal lines or vertical lines. Then let's take a look at the road element. So what I did was to go over to the top view and just draw a shape that goes along the grid that we created. And I basically did this by using the pen tool. And if we click G to bring it up, you can click on a point. And then instead of just clicking over here, you might not really have a straight line. Well, what you can do is hold down Shift, and this will create a perfect horizontal line, and then do a vertical line. So you can hold down Shift again, and that will create a perfect vertical line. Now, of course, you wouldn't want a fill effect on this. So if you go down here under the shape 2 that was created, we can uncheck fill and then play around with the stroke, since this one has a dash effect. And I just added a trim paths effect to animate it to come on. Then we have these plus icons, which are just a couple of lines that cross each other. All right, let's select the road, and we'll delete the other path that we created, and we'll collapse that, and we'll go over to the custom view 1. You can also see that we have some text here, which is positioned in front of the entire island. And now finally, let's take a look at how I set up these location icons. We'll go over to layer, new solid. We'll rename this to location. Set it to 1000 by 1000 and hit OK. Then we'll solo it out, and we'll double click on the ellipse tool to make a perfect circle, and then select one of these points and then hold down Ctrl and Shift to scale it down proportionally. We'll move it up a bit, and then we'll select the bottom point and we'll move it down. And finally, we'll just click and hold on the pen tool, and we'll switch to the convert vertex tool. Now, if we click on the bottom point, that should switch it to a linear point as opposed to having curves. And now finally, we do also need to have a hole right here in the center. So we'll double click on the ellipse tool to once again create a perfect circle. We'll double click on that. We'll scale it down. We could have even duplicated the original one that we had just to make sure everything is in the right spot, but it doesn't matter. There seems fine. And now finally, we can set this to subtract. And there you go. We have a location icon. Now, of course, you would then go over to make this a 3D layer and then position it properly and animate it. But that's pretty much it. Now let's delete this, and let's just take a look at the animation values real quick. So we'll just make sure nothing is selected, and we'll hit U on the keyboard, and this will bring up every single keyframe that was animated. Now if we make some room here, you can see what's going on. Now for most of these elements, I only animated the primary effects such as the position, rotation, and opacity. But then there's some effects here that I tweaked as well. For example, with the grid, like I showed you before, I animated the width of the grid to be a bit smaller, and then as it scales up, it becomes larger. Then with the road, we have a trim paths effect, which is serving the purpose of revealing the road. I also adjusted the size of the starburst effect, as you can see here. One thing I remember doing is having these plus icons to constantly rotate. We can see that if we hit R to bring up the rotation, and there's an arrow here because we have set up an expression. And if we just solo this out, bring back the view here, we can go over to top view, and you can see it's constantly rotating. And we can do that by adding an expression to the respective rotation controller. So in this case, it's the Z rotation. And I basically just added the time times 30 value. And what this says is basically it's going to spin by 30 degrees every second. So if we go over to 0 seconds, you can see the Z rotation is at 0. And if we go over to 1 second, it's at 30 degrees. All right, so that's all there is to the map design. Let's now take a look at the weapons design. All right, so right away you can see that there are some similarities between this one and the watch hologram. And that's because I did copy the elements over and then just did some modifications to them. And on top of that, I added these weapon icons together with the arrows, which are all animated as if to say the character is swiping through them. Now, one more thing that you might not be able to see right now is that I have a base circle right below the weapon here, and we can see that a bit better if we once again increase the exposure, since it is very low in opacity, but it is visible back in the original comp. And if we go over here, we can select that this is the circle, and then it has a matte right at the center, so it's kind of like faded towards the core and then more intense towards the edges. We'll go back to the default exposure and we'll take a look at the weapon icons. First of all, we got the text, which is pretty straightforward. Then we have the arrows on the sides, and you can create these arrows by either using a solid or a shape. Let's just select the rectangle tool, make sure nothing is selected, and we'll double click. Then we can go down to the rectangle path, right click on it, convert to Bezier path, and we'll hit G to bring up the pen tool. We'll select the mask, and we'll turn the masks on, and we can maybe select one of these points and just delete it, and we can center this over. By the way, you can turn on the title action save and just make sure it is sitting roughly in the middle like so, and then you can just maybe scale it down, make adjustments, turn it into a 3D layer, and so on and so forth. So let's delete that and take a look at the weapons icon. So, well, you can see down here it says AK-47, MAC-10, and Glock. Well, those are all in their own pre-comps, so if we double click on one of them, you can see what that looks like. And if we right click, reveal layer source in project, we can see the original image. And I got this from Google, but it will be provided in the project file, so don't worry about that, just in case you want to use it. And if we double click to open this up, and turn on the transparency here because it is transparent and all the icons are black. And I got a bunch of icons here. We got some pistols, whatever. And I just used 3 of them and put them all in a single comp just to position them properly. And then duplicated this comp and just set the visibility to be on and off for their respective comps. As for the animation, we can go back here. And if we have nothing selected, hit U one more time and then hit the tilde key to maximize this view. You can take a look at all of these keyframes. First of all, we have the circles here scaling up and having their stroke width adjusted, opacity as well. So let's collapse these and then hit the tilde key again, maybe make some room so we can see what's going on, and that at the same time we can talk about the animation. We'll even solo all these elements. And basically I have everything parented to the Glock layer, and I animated the position and scale at the start to come up and scale up. And since the text is parented to it, it's gonna follow along. And then you can see here, there's this position shift, which goes from left to right. And the MAC-10 is also parented to it together with the text, so it just moves along. And I also animated the opacity to go to 0% for the Glock, and then come up to 100% for the MAC-10. And then it continues, and it does the same thing. Also, the arrows, I just animated the scale. I set the anchor point to be at the left side here, so when it scales up from that point. And just to make it look like the arrow is being pressed. Now on top of all these elements, I also added a matte layer and just masked it around this area so it doesn't go off into the distance. So you can see what happens if we uncheck the alpha matte. when this moves over, and also just turn the opacity up to 100%. You know, it just comes in out of nowhere. But that's all there was to the weapon design. Now let's finally take a look at the globe hologram. Now for the globe hologram, it did turn out to be a bit more complex compared to the other ones, mainly due to the fact that I used the CC sphere effect, which is a 2D effect, but we had to come up with a solution to make it seem as if it was indeed 3D. Now, normally I wouldn't go through this hassle. I would probably just use a 3D software for any 3D models, or I would even use Element 3D, for example. But we have to keep in mind that not everybody has access to a 3D software or paid plugins, for example, so we had to come up with a solution. Now, let's quickly take a look at how that was set up. As far as the effects go, they are pretty much all the same. Let's just first take a look at the pre-comp itself, and then we'll come back and see how we set up the CC sphere effect. So we'll double click on the globe here, and then we can uncheck the transparency. Let's just start off by toggling the visibility for all of these. Increase the exposure so we can see the dots. If we select this, you can see I just used the same effect as before. This is the star burst effect. On top of that, we have a grid, which is also using the earth texture as a matte. And the earth texture is this one. And we'll solo that out just so we can take a look at it real quick. And if we reveal in project, double click on it, you can see this is the original texture. And again, I'm gonna include this in the project files, but I just got this off of Google somewhere. And then if we go back, I did add some effects here. So if we go to the effects controls, first of all, this was not transparent, so it was black and white. Now let's just turn these off and turn off the Luma key effect. You can see that the white is not transparent. So what I had to do is use the Luma key effect, so we're left off with only the black parts. On top of that, I added the CC ball action effect. And what this effect does is basically just turns any texture you have into this pattern of dots. And you can play around with these settings, and I just tweaked these two values. So you got the grid spacing and you got the ball size. It's pretty similar to the starburst effect. And then finally, I just added a fill effect to make that pure white. Now for the earth matte, I used all the same effects, except I did not use the CC ball action effect, because if we do that and unsolo everything, turn this to black, you can see what happens. Basically, we're also matting those dots, and that gives us a very ugly looking effect, so we're gonna have to turn that off. And if we turn the earth back on, you can also see what happens with the simple choker effect. So select the earth matte, and this is without the simple choker. And then if we choke it around the edges, we just give it a bit more room to breathe here. And then finally, let me just reset this. I just added a top and bottom fill, which is pure white. Just added a few masks here to fill the grid. So we get that top and bottom. So you can see that's this spot. And then finally, I added an adjustment layer with a linear wipe effect, which basically just wipes everything from the bottom up. And you can see I also animated the anchor point value here to make it seem like it's also spinning constantly. And then one more value I think I animated was the thickness of the grid here. So you can see that at the start. Now let's go back to the main comp and take a look at the CC sphere effect. So that's right here. We can actually solo out the globe layer here. So first of all, in order to set up the globe to actually act as if it is indeed a 3D layer, what we had to do was to first off turn it into a 3D layer. Then we would right click, transform, auto orient, and then make sure it's oriented towards camera. And then we're gonna add some expressions to the X, Y, and Z rotation values. And the way we can do that is by alt clicking on these, and you can see they are already red. So the expression has already been added. Well, let's alt click and uncheck all of those, and we'll go back to default. And now let's go ahead and double click on the rotation X, and this will reveal them all in the timeline. So let's get started with the rotation X. We'll alt click and type in look at, then we'll type in this comp dot active camera dot position, comma position, and then we'll move forward to the right and we'll open square brackets and type in 0 and then let go. Then we'll copy this entire expression. So we'll select it all, Control C to copy. Do the same thing for the rotation Y, we'll just paste it. Just make sure you change this value to 1, and then the same thing for rotation Z, and just make sure you change this value to 2. And now it's gonna follow along. Now what happens if we say want to adjust the rotation of this, since now it's linked up to the position of the camera, and we can't really animate it? Well, The way we can fix this is very similar to how we set up the 2D track nulls with the 3D track nulls before. So what we can do is add these slider controls up here, which is the X, Y, and Z rotation. And what we have to do is just go over here, click space, type in plus, and then just pick whip this to the X rotation. And then do the same thing here, plus, pick whip it to the Y rotation. And then same thing again. And then on top of that, we're adding all of these values. So if we increase this, you can see how we can actually spin it around. All right, next up, let's take a look at a few options that the CC sphere effect provides. So first off, we got the radius, which basically controls the scale of this whole thing. Then we have a render mode, and currently it's set to full so we can see both sides of the globe. And then moving down, we got the light and shading menus, which I basically set it to 0 just because I didn't want to have any shading. Apart from the globe itself, I also duplicated it and created a separate comp which has a simple white solid with a couple of masks here that feather the top side, and then use that as a texture for the CC sphere effect, which allowed me to create this sort of energy shield around the globe. And I basically made it slightly a bit bigger, and I set the render mode to outside only because if we set it to full, we can see both sides and then it gets too intense. So I don't really want that. We'll go back to outside. And I believe I also adjusted the opacity here. And as for the animation, I simply animated it to reveal from the bottom up. So you can see if we scrub through time here, it just kind of reveals from the bottom. And we can see that a bit better right over here. So you can see how the masks are just being revealed from the bottom up. Well, alright guys, that's pretty much it as far as the tutorial goes. I tried to cover pretty much every step in as much detail as possible, but hopefully you don't mind me speeding things up in certain areas just because we have to keep in mind the length of the tutorial as well. But again, if you happen to have any questions, then just leave them down below in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer them. With all that said, let's now move on to the outro of this video. Alright guys, thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Weekend Visual Effects is a series we plan on continuing every weekend or at least every other weekend, so if you have any visual effects tutorial suggestions, then feel free to leave a comment down below. Also, if you'd like to see more videos like these, then consider subscribing and hitting that bell button to be notified whenever a new video comes out. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.